Well, thank you all for being here. My name is James Williams. I'm the president of Engaged Cuba. We're an umbrella coalition of private sector companies, trade associations, and human rights and civil society groups who are working to lift the travel ban and trade embargo with Cuba. We are blessed to be here to talk about the subject that we spend all of our time talking on, but I'm sure is not necessarily front of mind for all of you, and that's U.S.-Cuba relations. I first want to thank Congresswoman Lee and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for hosting this. We're going to have a two-part discussion today, and we're really blessed to have an incredible group of speakers who are going to have a chance to both guide a conversation up here and share some remarks, as well as take questions from the audience at the end. So please hold your thoughts and questions till the end, and we'll make sure to get it to you. I'd first like to introduce our panelists, a good friend and an incredible diplomat, the Ambassador of Cuba to the United States, Ambassador Cabañas. Thank you very much for being here. All the way from Oakland, we have Bryant Francis, who the Director of Aviation at the Port of Oakland. We're really blessed to have you here to give that perspective of both from what this relationship means from the port's perspective, but also from aviation as well. And then from the United States government, representing the Obama administration, Matthew Borman from the Department of Commerce, who is no stranger to anyone who's worked on Cuba. He is the guru of all things Cuba regulations, and can give the perspective on what has changed, what the administration has done to date, and its impact, as well as other challenges and the issues that remain between conducting commerce. And then, speaking of commerce, we have Reuben Smith-Vaughn, the executive director at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who oversees all their Cuba work. And so he can talk a lot about what the Chamber has been doing related to business engagement, both on the island and in the United States, as well as business opportunities and challenges moving forward. So I want to start this conversation. We're going to try to talk a lot about this first panel related to the opportunities and challenges on the economic and the governmental levels. So I haven't prepped any of the panelists for any of these questions, and so this is, bear with them and bear with me as we move forward with this. But we're very excited for this conversation, and hopefully you are too. So, Mr. Ambassador, you've become, since December 17th announcement, it seems like a nonstop deluge of interest in U.S.-Cuba relations, both from the U.S. private sector, but then also there's been, almost a sprint of government-to-government conversations, both dialogues that have been happening. Give us a feeling of what it's been like at the embassy over this last 18 months and how you all have been managing it.
Well, thank you, James. The short answer is a mess. But let me elaborate on that. First, to thank the Foundation for inviting us for organizing this panel. Of course, Congresswoman Barbara Lee and Karen Bass, and all members of the panel. Probably on most of the things I will address, Mr. Borman will say that we have a coincidence on that. As currently we have 19 different areas in which we are talking government to government, at the official level. That comes from health, or public health, where we signed an MOU recently, and our Minister for Public Health was working in the United States, and we are expecting the visit of Secretary Borman very soon. Up to law enforcement. We cover different areas, as I said, 19 different sectors. This week, this Monday, we established, we had the first round on what we call the economic dialogue, talking about opportunities and challenges. You have to understand that we are still, the public should understand that we are still under a sanction regime, a very comprehensive sanction regime. That is called in the States embargo. We call it in Cuba blockade, and then we agreed to call it embargo/blockade. But it's the same thing. And soon you will have again the debate at the United Nations, and we explain every year in details the impact of such a regime. But on the other hand, we have had 5 different packages of new regulations. We have been working in a professional way, both governments and institutions, although we understand that in order to arrive into a new era of bilateral relations, we have to, some issues have to be addressed in Congress, although we have the perception that the executive power has still a lot of capacity to continue changing regulations and to introduce, to provide the possibility for new opportunities. To summarize, as you said, we have received the incredible impact from the business community. I have here Miguel Vélez, who is an official at the trade office, and Janet Stable, that deals also with official issues. And it's amazing, the many people who have visited the embassy and then Cuba in order to address their concerns. And probably the most relevant result we have had so far is re-establishing the regular flights. You have seen how many companies are participating in that new opportunity, and basically the direct impact that that is having on passengers. The public, the people who simply travel back and forth. They are visiting Cuba under 12 categories, different categories. We cannot, when we talk about American visitors, we cannot say American tourists.
Not yet.
They are still visitors, but the good news is that they are increasing by 80 to 90% compared to last year. Of course, hospitality industry works like a chain. If you have direct flights, you have people coming. You have a Starwood with 3 different contracts in Cuba, and we are expecting the 4th one. And then that provides a lot of momentum for other companies related to at least the hospitality industry to come and have a new venture. That will be in general terms what we are going through these days. A lot of Cuban delegations now visiting not only Washington D.C. but California and many other states. We have the Havana Fair. Last year, for the first time, we have a large group organized by and led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a very large group. Hopefully, we are expecting for the details on the. It's not a message from the Chamber, but we are still working on the details.
This is an on-the-record discussion.
Yeah, and we this year we know that we will have again a large group of business people from the United States that will be welcome. And we expect that at some point they can play under the same rules in the Cuban sector. The economic life in Cuba. To finalize, to say that we are under a sanctions regime, considering the law in the United States. American businessmen are not under a sanctions regime in Cuba. We have national regulation for foreign investment that applies for everybody, Europeans, Africans, Asian, and the Americans. We don't have in Cuba one specific legislation dealing with American businesses. Then we expect that the changes that have to occur here, they take place. Thank you, James.
Well, thank you very much. And Matt, I'd love to get the perspective, because I think it's been, the ambassador referenced, numerous rounds of regulatory changes that the Obama administration has done since December 17, 2014, when the announcement was made that we were going to restart this relationship. Give us a flavor of, from your perspective and from the administration's perspective, what have been some of the most significant changes that have happened for sort of the layman audience, knowing that this gets very complicated very quickly.
Sure. Let me start off by just sketching out the broad brush here, just so everybody has the same perspective. As the ambassador said, we've got a series of laws that have been in place for many years that essentially comprise what we call the embargo, as the ambassador said, the Cubans call it the blockade. And from a literal perspective, what that means is basically any kind of transaction that U.S. persons do, or even foreign people do with U.S. origin stuff, with Cuba needs a government authorization. And so historically, the way we've, in the executive branch, have implemented the trade embargo with Cuba is the Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control is responsible for regulating travel and financial transactions. And we at Commerce and the Bureau of Industry and Security are responsible for implementing controls on the export, re-export of the term we use is items subject to our regulations, but it's essentially items made in the United States or foreign-made items with a certain amount of U.S. content re-exported from that third country to Cuba. All of that requires, because of the embargo, either specific authorization from us at Commerce or Treasury, depending if it's a financial transaction or an actual export or trade, or it could be authorized by what Treasury calls a general license and we call a license exception. So the consequence of that, again, is we have a whole third category of exports that apply to most other countries for most items, and it's no license required. So for example, last year, there was about $6 billion worth of U.S. exports to the Dominican Republic. And less than 1% by dollar value went under either a specific license or a general authorization. In contrast with Cuba, because of the embargo, last year there was roughly $200 million worth of U.S. exports to Cuba, and all of that had to go under either a specific authorization where the company comes into the government, submits an application, has to wait until we, the government, say yes or no, or a general authorization. So that's the practical consequence for trade of the embargo. But since the president's announcement and the change in policy, as was mentioned, both we and Treasury have done 5 sets of changes to our respective regulations as they relate to trade and financial transactions and travel with Cuba. I will briefly summarize the Treasury ones, and then if anybody wants to ask me questions, I can try to answer them, but with the caveat that I'm not OFAC, I'm BIS. But generally speaking, as you heard now, there are 12 categories of authorized travel, which exclude tourism, that travelers self-certify. So it's a Treasury general license. And almost all of the other changes Treasury has made are general licenses, and they're self-certification. So some of the more significant ones have been authorizing so-called U-turn transactions, where, say, a Cuban buyer is buying something, say, from a European seller, and that the financing or the payment for that transaction goes through a U.S. bank. That used to be prohibited. The U.S. bank would have to stop or block that transaction. Now that can be allowed. The general authorizations, even for people-to-people travel, which is an authorized category, that's been a big change. The ability to establish a physical or business presence in Cuba under a general license, that's another big change under the Treasury rules. There are other ones, those I think are some of the more significant ones. On the commerce side, we really have 2 pieces. One piece is we've expanded some existing license authorizations, so for donations of pretty much anything for humanitarian purposes, we've expanded that to allow consolidators to do that. Consumer communication devices can go to Cuba for private use, essentially, or individual use under license exception. And then we created a whole new license exception called Support for Cuban People. And I would say the 2 most significant pieces of that from a trade perspective are essentially anything that's at a lower level from an export control viewpoint can go to private sector actors in Cuba under this license exception. So the U.S. exporter self-certifies and they make the export without coming to us, to the government, to ask permission. So, for example, items going to the private restaurants, the Paladars, the Casa Particulares, the private bed and breakfast, the private small hotels, those kinds of supplies to auto repair, beauty shops, hair salons, all that kind of stuff can go under this license exception. They don't have to come into the government for authorization. That also includes lower level items going to Atexa, which is the Cuban telecom provider. And the policy goal is there to help the Cubans communicate with each other in the outside world. And then even for things that need a license, so for example, going to state-owned enterprises, if the purpose of the export is ultimately going to benefit the Cuban people, production of consumer goods, for example, that has a favorable licensing policy. Safety of civil aviation, environmental protection, all of those need licenses but would likely be approved. So it's a much different regulatory environment than before the president's announcement. And then the last thing I'll mention is, I think generally, Ambassador, outside observers think that there's roughly 500,000 self-employed Cubans, cuentapropistas, and easily thousands of co-ops, mostly in the agriculture area, but also in areas like construction and accounting and so on. So from our perspective in the government, the contraropistas, the self-employed, and the co-ops qualify as private sector for purposes of our regulation.
Thank you very much. And so, Reuben, why don't we take that complicated regulatory changes that had to happen? Because part of the challenge you see, as the ambassador outlined and Matt outlined, is that the embargo is this whole thicket of sanctions that have been codified under a series of different laws. And once, doing something so simple as we just want to allow this type of trade to happen involves peeling back, hundreds of pages of regulations in many cases. And so let's put this more in the plain business speak. Since the December 17th announcement, what have you seen in terms of the sectors and the companies that have been most interested and most enthusiastic about opportunities? And then where has it been, where there's been enthusiasm, but there's been congressional codification of laws that have not allowed that to really take place and flourish?
Thanks, James. And I also want to thank the Congressional Black Caucus for putting this on. It's important that we continue momentum to build on what President Obama's done. This is really important steps. Opening up this space is extremely important, something the Chamber's been working on for well over 20 years. And the more we can do to help continue to drive this conversation, we really much appreciate that. And I also want to thank Matt for doing his best to try explaining what is extremely complex. And I think that reality really underlines a lot of the challenges that we're facing. When the President made the announcement, the joint announcement on December 17th, almost 2 years ago now, there was a massive influx of interest into the Cuban market. Not because the Cuban market had changed. In fact, the Cuban market had been changing really starting in 2011 as the Cuban economy looked to really adjust itself to engage in global markets. But because of this kind of a major announcement that happened, we had a massive influx of, the Chamber has over 3 million members, the influx of companies calling the Chamber and saying what's happening on the ground in Cuba. And the reality is that unlike any other market in the world that the Chamber operates in, we have this network of 117 American chambers of commerce around the world. We have this massive network of U.S. embassies that we have. We don't have any of that in Cuba. And so this lack of not only understanding the market, but knowing the market and knowing the people in the market was really the major, I think, obstacle that we faced thus far and our companies have faced. Because doing business anywhere is about knowing the people you're doing business with, right? Going down to that market, understanding what that market's priorities and needs are, and then understanding how you do business with them. And so we're starting at ground zero here, right? We're starting at what does this market look like? How do we do business there? Who are we doing business with? What are their interests? And so before you even get to the regulatory realities, you have to first start understanding that piece of it, that component, that cultural reality. And so what we've been doing first and foremost is, I think, really 3 prongs of engagement. The first is sitting with our companies and explaining what is the Cuban market? What's the size of the Cuban market? What are the priorities of the Cuban government? What are they trying to achieve and how can we engage in that space? The second is then taking those companies and going to the embassy, and which is why the ambassador talked about that massive influx of folks that have been knocking on his door constantly. There's a line outside the embassy every single morning. And then taking them down to Cuba and literally meeting with their customers, just like you do in any other market of the world. Going down to Cuba, going to the Feria Havana, as the ambassador mentioned, and meeting with their Cuban counterparts. Also meeting with other companies that have been working there, right? So while U.S. banks haven't been working in Cuba for the last 25 years, the National Bank of Canada has been there for well over 25 years. And so talking to them and understanding what that market looks like. And then once you start building those personal connections, then the companies can come back and start digging into this complex web of regulations that we have. And the sanctions regime that oversees Cuba is far more complex than any other sanctions regime the United States has ever put in place, because there's a myriad of laws that have been passed over the past 3 decades that have helped form the sanctions. And so, as James mentioned, you can take off one layer of the onion, but there's so many more layers of this onion that you have to get through. And Matt started going into the complexities of shipping from a third country, the components that go into that, whether you bring it to the United States. Does OFAC have oversight? Does BIS have oversight? And so this very complex web has made it very challenging. That being said, there are companies still extremely interested in that. And I think, the first ship by Carnival arriving a few months, or I guess 6 months ago now, the announcement by Starwood, who after 2.5 years of working with the Cuban government were able to get their deal to come to fruition, the airlines beginning regularized flights. It shows that despite the sanctions that exist, right, in spite of all the challenges that our Congress has put in place, unfortunately, there still is a lot of opportunity, there's still a lot of interest. And I think that interest goes across industries. It's not just in the travel, the authorized travel, we won't say tourism, the authorized travel And it's not just in the construction space where the hotels are very interested in working there, but the biopharmaceutical space that the Cubans have advanced over the years is unbelievable. The workforce that exists in Cuba, the human capital the capacity is great. And so I think there will continue to be a lot of interest, and as long as we can continue to have these conversations and explain why it's important to continue to evolve this relationship, we can hopefully get to a place where we have regularized opportunities like our U.S. companies have anywhere else in the world.
Wonderful. Well, before I turn it over to Brian to talk a little bit more, particularly about what the ambassador outlined as one of the most major and significant changes that have happened, which is the restarting of direct flights and what that sort of holds from the United States and the Cuban perspective. I want to pause because we're joined by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, and I'd love to give her an opportunity to give some remarks because I think we're here for a bunch of reasons. I think a panel like this, while maybe seeming insignificant in the larger scheme that it's happening at all, is a result of a lot of work and a period of time in politics where maybe this wouldn't have been possible, where you have someone from the U.S. administration, the Cuban ambassador, the business community, and others all getting together and talking about how we can move this relationship forward. So that in and of itself is significant, and I think, in addition, obviously, to the leadership of President Obama, the Black Caucus, and particularly Congresswoman Lee, has been a champion on this issue more than almost anyone for decades, and it's because of her work and the work of her peers that we've been able to get to this point. So I want to recognize her and thank you for her leadership.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and I'm just going to be very brief, but I just want to first welcome all of you to this very historic panel. I believe this is the first one we've done on Cuba. If it's not, it's the second one. But I just want to thank you for being such visionaries and being here at such a historic time. And also to all my friends on the panel, thank you all very much for your voices, for your participation today, but also for staying the course, as it relates to U.S. relations with Cuba. We've still got a long way to go. As you know, we've got to end the embargo. We've got to end the travel ban. President Obama has pushed this ball forward. But it's up to Congress now to act. And so what you all are doing this weekend is extremely important because you go back to I have to tell you, go back to your members of Congress and ask them to sign on to our bills. I mean, I'm pretty simple and basic in this because that's what needs to happen so that we can really have true normal relations with Cuba. Yes, I have visited the island since 76 or 77. Probably more than 23, 24 times now. So I have visited this island 90 miles away, Afro-Hispanic Cuban island, and seen the transition and the ups and the downs. But I've also recognized the resilience and the pride of the Cuban people and the dignity of the Cuban people and the fact that they love Americans, they love the people of our country. And so it's just such an important moment in our history. To move forward on normalizing relations, and all of our panelists here and all of the work that they're doing, whether it's in the business sector, the diplomatic corps, whether it's in the educational sector, the cultural sector, whatever, policymakers, we have to really join together and have that political push on Capitol Hill so we can do this. Of course, I would love to do this and hope we can do it while President Obama is still in office. That would be quite a legacy. Quite a moment in his legacy. It would be historic. I had the privilege to be part of the delegation when the president visited with, of course, my sister Congresswoman Karen Bass and others. We were down there when the president was there. Also when Secretary Kerry went last year to lift the flag at the embassy. And so we've come a long way, but there are a lot of things our government still has not done that makes it very difficult to have normal relations. So I just want to say how proud I am of how far we've come, because I've been there for many, many years and seen how far we've come and know how far we've come and know what it takes to get this ball to the finish line. And all of you are going to be part of that whole process. So thank you again for being here, and thank you all of the panelists. It's really good to see everybody. God bless.
Thank you so much. Well, one thing that we think that the congressman referenced was the importance of lifting the travel ban. the importance of people-to-people contact, and we're going to get into that in real detail and with some experts in our next panel. But I do want to talk and go back to what I think is how we're actually going to get to be able to do that, which is the development and advent of direct commercial flights between the United States and Cuba for the first time in this new relationship. I'd love, Brian, to get your perspective on both from the port and then how you're seeing this generally and what its importance is, as well as some of the challenges that still remain.
Certainly. Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for being here, everyone. I'd like to start off by saying thank you to the foundation and specifically to Congresswoman Lee for the invitation and having the Port of Oakland be here at the table today. We are honored. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak on behalf of sort of the aviation community, if you will. And I want to say it's really an exciting time, quite frankly. I mean, for the first time in, I think, many of the lives of people in this room, there will be an opportunity through one of those 12 categories at the present time to actually travel on scheduled air service between the U.S., various points in the U.S., and Cuba, Havana, as well as other markets within Cuba. And there were quite a number of carriers who expressed interest in operating that service. There's going to be 20 flights offered per day into Havana, and then a number of other flights to other cities throughout the country. And about 3,000, or rather 20,000 seats per week each way is what it looks to be roughly into Havana once all the flights are up and running. Most of the markets that were selected were in the eastern half of the country. I think a lot of it really centered around those markets that had the highest population of residents of Cuban descent, and with the higher propensity to travel potentially to and from Cuba. And so there were a number of airlines that vied for the limited amount of capacity or flights that will be operating to and from Cuba. The first flights have begun. Many more are coming by November of this year. And clearly it's opening up a new opportunity for trade, for commerce, and for travel that will be easier than ever before. I think that one of the most important things from an aviation standpoint is going to be that for the first time in a very, very long time in sort of modern day aviation, there will be data available that the number crunchers at the headquarters of the various airlines will actually be able to grab and put into their analyses to determine the types of markets that may be able to support this service. They'll see exactly where they're coming from, because it may not be just the city where the nonstop flight is operating from into Havana or the other cities in Cuba, but they could be connecting coming from other markets. And that's sort of where a lot of the other parts of the country come into play that didn't get that nonstop service, such as the San Francisco Bay Area. Oakland does have the authority for charter activity. I know Congresswoman Lee has been very passionate about this for a long period of time, and we have had a number of discussions with air carriers about the opportunity to provide access on a charter basis. Certainly we'll continue to have those discussions going forward. The only market on the West Coast that was included in this round of awards was Los Angeles. Alaska applied for 2 daily flights from LAX, and they got 1. So there will be 1 flight per day operating on Alaska, and then it is from Texas east. But regardless, there's 20 flights per day, roughly 20,000 seats per week each way, and very exciting time. Being able to add that other component or category to visit Cuba will be important over the long term, but this is a tremendous start, and it'll be very exciting to see how it all plays out.
Wonderful, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Ambassador, you know, it's been referenced on this panel, this upcoming trade fair that happens every year in Havana, and I think it's important for folks to understand, you know, both why this is important, but also that every year Cuba unveils its next portfolio of opportunities for foreign investment at this. And so I'd love to give a perspective on what that means for the United States. And then I'd love from your perspective, since the CBC has been such a dedicated player and partner in this normalization process for decades, for you to just give a personal perspective on, you know, it's meant to have the CBC as a partner, what their role has been, and why that's been so important.
Thank you, James, for this question, because I had in mind precisely to complement a little bit what Congresswoman Lee just said. And we can say that if we are living this moment now, it's also a victory for CBC. I mean, for many, many years, members of the caucus have been visiting. Well, Barbara herself, Congresswoman Karen Bass, many other members, a few others that they are not with us anymore. But for many years, the caucus acted as a channel of communications with our society, informing people about the changes in Cuba, about the policy in Cuba, about the many details that in the past put us apart, and the moment when we didn't have bilateral ties as we have today, bringing delegations with them, young people. I mean, if we want to build a future, we have to start today with the new generation, and that's exactly what the caucus has been doing for many years. People from universities, different kind of NGOs and business people as well. Then they have been in the forefront of this, I wouldn't say a fight, but in some way it was to bring both countries closer and our population, our people closer. And then of course they have many reasons to celebrate actually. And we thank them, all of them. We meet very often. And as Barbara said, right now in the many pieces of proposal and draft of legislation that have been discussed these days in Congress, several of them are positive developments, and many members of the caucus are involved in those debates. Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to have an opportunity after the second panel to ask questions of the panelists that are up here now. So I just want to take the opportunity here to invite folks to give 1 to 2 minutes of closing thoughts on the relationship as they see it from their organizations, and then moving forward, any sort of parting wisdom or advice that they see as folks are navigating this complexity. And maybe we'll start with Matt and then work back.
I think what I would like to emphasize is, even though you heard we have significant restrictions under the existing embargo, with the regulatory changes that we in Treasury have done, there's actually a lot of opportunity. I mean, since 2014, beginning of 2015, we at Congress have authorized over $6 billion of potential exports to Cuba. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity there. And the thing that I think has been very positive in our discussions with our Cuban counterparts is there's quite a bit of overlap in the Cuban government priorities: infrastructure, renewable and clean energy, health, and what we already authorize. So I would really urge everyone in the business community to really look at that, come in and talk to us to get the details, and really look to take advantage of it, because these are things I think the Cuban government is very interested in, and we in the U.S. government, even within the construct of the embargo, have the ability already to authorize. So,
Great, thank you. Reuben.
Thanks. I would say that for 50 years we had in place a regime that was there to help empower the Cuban people, and ultimately it didn't achieve that goal. And what we've seen over the last 2 years, thanks to the leadership of the current administration and to members of Congress like Congressman Lee, we had this new strategy of engagement, and this strategy of engagement empowers all of us here in the United States to really drive for something better, to drive for greater prosperity on both sides of the relationship. And we hope to work with everybody here and the U.S. business community to not only take advantage of the openings that the administration has made and that Matt and those at OFAC and state have helped really create for the private sector, but also to help create greater prosperity in Cuba as well. And so we look forward to working with all the business community, but also with our members in Congress to continue to drive that change and to push for changes that we can make now, whether it be in ag financing or in travel, but ultimately to see those sanctions ultimately removed so that we can have the true bilateral relationship that should exist between such close neighbors.
Thank you very much. Bryant.
So I think that the air carriers that were awarded who have the opportunity to provide this new service to Cuba from various markets in the U.S. are ultimately, I believe, in it for the long haul. I think that they see an opportunity to be a part of something exciting, something new, opening up new territory for them, for their customers, for their networks, to create additional levels of travel, new market opportunities. And what will be, I think, the most interesting thing is to see how it all plays out as we continue to see more or higher levels of relaxed rules, if you will, expanding on what has been put into place in this first round. And I'm looking forward to the future when hopefully we will have the opportunity to have direct service from the Bay Area, specifically from Oakland, and that will be a great day indeed. But this is an incredible start, and I'm happy this day has come.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for being here.
Certainly.
And the final word to our the diplomatic supermodel from Cuba here, Ambassador Vaughn.
Well, thank you again. No, briefly, our government, our people, we believe that we can live as neighbors, as Reuben said, as long as we can talk to each other as equals, we can show respect, we can show reciprocity, because we have been talking about the flights to Cuba, and we expect Cuban Airlines to fly at some point to the United States as well. I think we will be able to accomplish many things. That what has happened during the last year and a half. I mean, the many MOUs and other agreements we have is precisely as a result of talking as equals and showing respect and in a sense of reciprocity. In economic terms, the embargo, the blockade is there, is the major limit so far. And if we really want to enjoy a different kind of relationship at every level, from government to societies, then there you have a major hurdle, a major limit that should be removed at some point. And I would like to thank you again, the CBC and the Foundation for organizing the panel, for addressing these issues, for the people who are listening from us, the public, the panelists, and the opportunity to be here with you as well. Thank you. This is a signal from somewhere.
I can't tell. That's from on high, but it might have been from on low. Thank you all to the panelists. This is a part of a historic time, and I hope that for the folks who have been able and have been working on this issue, deserve credit and congratulations for what's happened, and for folks who have not been. Now's the time to get active, because obviously it's really exciting time. Please let your voices be known with your members of Congress and your staff. We still have a lot more work to do to see this moving forward. As I mentioned, I saw some hands going up. After the second panel, all the panelists are going to come back up and take questions. So we'll just hold, and I promise we'll get back to you very, very briefly. But please join me in giving a round of applause for our panelists. We're going to do a little scene change here and come up with a second panel. So everyone who's on the next panel, please join us on stage. Thank you all for being here again. Again, for folks who were not here earlier, my name is James Williams. I'm the president of Engaged Cuba, which is an umbrella coalition of private sector companies and organizations working to lift the travel and trade embargo with Cuba. We are really thankful to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Congresswoman Lee, and other leaders who are able to put this event together today to talk about what has become a really exciting topic. If you've been reading the newspaper for the last 18 months, it's almost every other day there's a front page story about Cuba. And what we've found is both the interest is at the governmental level, just the restarting diplomatic relations, at the business level, the opportunities that can be shared, and then also on the person-to-person level, the cultural level, what both countries can offer each other from a human perspective. And so we're really blessed to have this second panel really dive into these issues in more detail. We're blessed to have Colin Laverty, who runs Cuba Educational Travel and is an advisory board member of the Center for Democracy in the Americas. Really, no one knows more about American travel to Cuba than Colin. So everyone who's looking to get down to the island, he's the guy to know, as well as a lot of the policy dynamics that impact travel. We're also blessed to have Sarah Kinosian from WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, which is a think tank and advocacy organization working on human rights and policy areas in the Americas. Thank you so much for being here. As well as straight from Havana, Cuba, the Cuba medical health czar, Gail Reed, who runs Rents and Found Medic, which is a program and organization that she can explain more, but basically bridges gaps between U.S. and Cuban health sector and how they can learn from each other and benefit each other. So first, let's talk about what everyone is excited about, travel between the U.S. and Cuba. Colin, we've heard about these 12 categories, what's changed, what hasn't changed, but as someone who is on the front lines of this every day, what has the demand been like? And how do people go about doing this, and what can they still not do on the travel piece?
Well, thank you, James, for moderating the panel. Thanks for the host. Thank all of you for being here. Gail and I, who are both fresh up from Havana, are used to hot weather and afternoon rain showers, and it's beautiful outside, so we appreciate you're in here with us instead of taking advantage of the nice DC weather. In terms of demand for changes in travel and then demand for travel, one of the things I laughed at, it's very true, if you drive down 16th Street, you'll see the line of kind of businessmen lining up outside the Cuban embassy. You'll also see a line on the other end at the consulate of people figuring out, how do I get a visa? And then you'll have someone like me, the phone's ringing for business people, for universities, for churches, for the guy who wants to take his grandson scuba diving. And the questions are always, can I do it? What can I do? And how do I do it? The biggest change I want to say in policy, in terms of travel, is yes, anyone can go to Cuba. You have to go under one of these 12 categories, which won't apply to some of them won't apply to everyone. Journalists, it's very specific. You have to be a journalist. But there are categories such as professional research and people-to-people travel, which are very general. They apply to anyone, and anyone can fit into that category. So to give you kind of concrete examples, if you are a pianist and you want to do professional research on music in Cuba, you can buy a ticket, go to Cuba, and you must have a full-time schedule of activities related to that research. So you should be looking at music in Cuba. Full-time schedule isn't defined by law. It should be 3 or 4 meetings per day. These can be informal conversations with a pianist. It can be going to a place where music is being played and writing it down. And it's that simple. You'll keep a log of that, and you are legally traveling under that category. In terms of people to people, this is the category that's been used the most over the last 4 or 5 years, where you've seen really significant growth of American travelers to Cuba. Previously to changes that were made by the Obama administration, you had to sign up with an outfit that would organize a trip for you. So an organization like mine, or any civil society group or a tour agency, would put together a 5, 6, 7 day package with activities throughout the day so that you could comply. Well, the Obama administration recently changed that, so you can go on your own. You don't have to go with an outfit, and the only requirement is that you have a full-time schedule of people-to-people activities. And people-to-people activities can be defined as anything that's non-touristy / involves meaningful interaction with Cubans. So as long as you're spending most of your time interacting with Cubans, which again can be hiring a private taxi driver for the day and spending time with him, and he brings you to his house and you have dinner with his family, etc. There's many ways to fill that category. There's still organizations that are offering these trips, and so you can sign up. But I'd say the answer is anyone can go. We talked about flights. After this, I encourage you, go on Delta, go on United, go on American. They're selling the flights. There's one screen that pops up. Anyone that's familiar with travel to Cuba can remember the days where there was pages of affidavits that you had to sign, and now you go on American and you see one page, and you don't even have to click your category. It just says you must fill one of these categories. You click OK, buy your ticket. There's great deals. You can fly from New York to Havana in December for $400. There's specials all over the place. So check that out. There's a ton of demand, and I just say it's very interesting, kind of the scope. There was, for a while, there was mainly educational travel, and then there was kind of, we would call them the Golden Girl trips, because there were these overpriced packages that would cost you $6,000-$7,000 to go to Cuba for 10 days, and it's who has that money and who has the time to do that. So you kind of see that demographic. And now there's just newfound interest at all levels. There's a lot of young people going down in small groups of 3 or 4 and staying in an Airbnb, et cetera. And so the diversity of interest in what's actually happening is very healthy for U.S. and Cuba people getting to know each other and building constructive relationships. Go to Cuba.
And on top of that, I guess, what have been some of the changes in the increase in travel between, over the last few years from Americans going to Cuba?
So the number, last year it increased, about 200%. So you've seen there was 3 or 4 years, prior, from 2011 to 2012 to about 2015, you'd see about 100,000 Americans of non-Cuban descent, plus about 350, 400,000 Cuban Americans. You're at about 500,000, which is substantial in the sense that we're now the second leading source of visitors to the island, the first being about 1 million Canadians. And now that number's grown. There's an uptick in Cuban American travel, so that's around 500,000. And then you have Americans of non-Cuban descent that's gone from about 100,000 to, we'll see what we finish this year at, but it'll be somewhere above 200,000, I think. And I think for next year we can expect with these flights, we talked about Starwoods, talked about Airbnb, and just normalizing this process where anyone can go on and book. And I don't think it's going to be long before we have 300,000, 400,000, or 500,000 Americans of non-Cuban descent, plus 500,000 Cuban Americans. So we'll reach 1 million hopefully soon.
So Sarah, thank you, Colin. So, this is a room who is interested in seeing change on the embargo, seeing change on the travel ban. What are these trips and people connecting back and forth? What does that mean, and what does that do for the advocacy work here in Washington that you're leading?
Yeah. So I think that, over the past year, we've seen a lot of movement in Congress. The real sticking point really has been more in the House on the Republican side. But all of this, engagement begets engagement. And I think that that's true across all sectors. So in terms of travel, you're seeing an increase in constituencies wanting to see the travel ban be lifted, wanting to see the embargo end. And the more engagement there is between normal people, normal Cubans and Americans, the more you see a change in the constituencies. And hopefully, that filters up, because more and more Congress is not going to be able to ignore what their constituencies want. And then, that goes up to business engagement. And, as was discussed in the last panel, it would be better to see more of that, because the administration really has broadened the scope of what's possible. So the more engagement there is, the more appetite there will be for engagement. And the more benefits will be brought to both societies.
Wonderful. And so I want to share, this is hot off the press, because one of the reasons that this policy hasn't changed for a very long time has been that there was, strong opposition in the Cuban American community in South Florida for decades to this. And I think one of the things that has been a major factor in allowing this policy to change and having President Obama driving it forward has been that the views of that community have dramatically shifted. And so yesterday, Florida International University just released a poll of 1,000 Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade, which I just want to share a couple of the top lines with you. Because again, this is all Cuban Americans in South Florida, and it's 63% oppose the embargo, and 74% want to see the travel ban being lifted. So this was the community that was held out. Because if you look at the numbers across the United States, CBS did a poll, it's 81% of Americans support lifting the travel ban, 71% support lifting the full embargo. So American people outside of South Florida have been on record for a very long time opposing this and want to get this done. It was, a strong and concentrated group of people that were opposed to this. And now that has really changed. So we should feel like the weight of history is on our side, but we still need to keep moving forward. And we expect and hope that there will be some action on the travel issue in the very near term. But one thing that has been very interesting for folks who follow Cuba has been how Cuba has handled its medical and health system. And there are a lot of benefits that both normalization between our countries can offer, but in no better place really than health. And so again, I'd love to talk a little bit about the Cuban health system, some of the advances they've made in very difficult circumstances, and what that may mean or could mean for the United States.
Thanks very much. First, thanks to Representative Lee for her tireless advocacy in this area, and also to Congressmember Bass, as well as Congressmember Lee, for leading the charge with their letter to the President, urging him to take more action that would eliminate the red tape that would allow us actually to test some of these wonderful innovations, or very promising innovations, for the health of the American people. As I listen to this conversation, I'm struck. We've talked about how complicated things are, how complicated all of the politics are, how complicated the embargo is, but how some progress is being made, that we're hopeful for the future and obviously for the Obama administration's legacy. But to me, some things just can't wait, and some things are just urgent. And the realities are very simple. And the realities are of our own population, of our own people in the States, is that I think we have things to learn from Cuba. As many people know, they have very similar health outcomes with less disparities than the United States at a fraction of the budget. How do they do community health? We need to know more about that. How does that happen? We need to know more about how they train young doctors, and in fact have made what we've now calculated is a $60 million investment in primary health care in the United States by training over 200 young people from low-income communities, basically communities of color, to come back and serve those communities. Those are students who have been on full scholarship. Yet today you still cannot pay to go to medical school in Cuba. So there's lots of things we can learn. There's lots of things that this cooperation, which MEDIC has been working on now for 20 years, I think could produce. We also have things that we can offer to Cuba. I think the technologies in the States, I think that some of the organization of health services, there are many things that we have to offer. But the main thing is, we need to cooperate for the benefit of the health of people in both countries. We need that desperately. We're seeing now the first bilateral meeting on Zika coming up in November after Secretary Burwell's visit to the PAHO meeting on Zika in Cuba in October. There's a very real reason why they're meeting in Cuba, and that's because Cuba has the Pan American Health Organization, the World Health Organization Collaborating Center at the Institute of Tropical Medicine on dengue, chikungunya, that disease none of us can pronounce, and Zika, all of the arboviruses. That center is in Havana. What do we know about Zika? What do we know about these pesky mosquitoes that, by the way, are in New York already? We need to know about that, but we also need to know about other things. And they're urgent things. In our country, 75,000 people a year are amputated for diabetic foot ulcers. There's a Cuban medication which the FDA, as far as I understand it, is most willing to test, that has, in 20 countries, reduced the risk of amputation by 70%. That's a huge reduction. It's a huge reduction in human suffering. It's a huge reduction in expenditures. And if you look at the population, you look at the demographics in this country about who is suffering from diabetes, we know what those demographics are. 16% of the Native American population suffers diabetes. 15% of the African American population suffers diabetes, as compared to only 7% of the white population, non-Hispanic. And so these are very real and urgent issues for MEDIC, for the organization that I work for. These are some of the reasons that we want to pursue and fight for cooperation between our two countries. But there are some things that are just in the middle. That is the red tape. And that allowed us then, and actually prompted us, to produce a white paper for President Obama, which indicates what he can still do to lessen that red tape, to remove the obstacles, so that it is not the Treasury Department, but the FDA that decides whether this medication, whose name is Heberpro-P, is good or not for diabetic foot ulcers. It should be the FDA, not the organization, pardon me for saying this, but not the organization that collects my taxes. It should be the FDA that decides whether a medication is good for use. And our people are dying from this. A person whose leg is amputated, whose foot is amputated, half of those people will die within 5 years. Not to mention the cost for their families, for the disability, for even Medicare and Medicaid. So there is no reason on this earth why we should not do this now. And so thanks to Congresswoman Lee and also Congresswoman Bass, they've picked up on our white paper, which we produced in February, which has 7 things that President Obama can do now, before the embargo is even lifted, that would allow these Cuban innovations to be tested and to be even fast-tracked. Because the embargo's red tape is holding up testing of what may be American diabetics' best chance to save not only their limbs but their lives. So we think cooperation is urgent.
Gail, I mean, this is on everyone's minds, and should have been on other people's minds a lot sooner. Zika, you referenced this, and Cuba has done some things dramatically well. How has Cuba handled Zika versus what you've seen or not seen thus far from the U.S. government, and what are some lessons to be shared?
Well, I think that we're still fighting for the funds for Zika prevention in the United States. I think the president is still fighting for funding. That's the first thing, is that we probably have not invested enough in it. Second, we don't know enough about it, nor about the vectors that carry it. What the Cubans have done is simply to expand their community-based programs that they had for dengue virus against the same mosquito that carries Zika. I always had to laugh when they said, you'll see in the U.S. press, well, they militarized this. They sent out the military to fumigate people's homes. Yeah, well, it was the reserves. It was the civilian reserves that they sent around. Young men who came to your home, fumigated your home, fumigated the streets, and then there's a whole process. If you're going to Cuba, ask the taxi driver how he protects his family against dengue, Zika, and this mosquito. He'll tell you. You change the water in the dog dish, you change the water in the flower vase. These mosquitoes love to live in clean water inside your home. They don't live outside in swampy land, they live in clean water. So, there's lots of things Cubans know, and they know it because they've been educated about it. And that, I think, is the #1 thing that they've done. They also have, obviously, important clinical and treatment variations. But Zika is really dangerous, not only to pregnant women, but it's also dangerous because it has very few symptoms. It's not like dengue, which I don't know if anybody's from the English-speaking Caribbean, but they call it breakbone fever, right? And they call it that for a reason. But Zika is very mild on the face of it.
Well, thank you. Well, hopefully that dialogue will continue, and it seems like, at least now for the first time, the United States is really spending a lot more time trying to learn from Cuba on that. Well, it's tough to follow up saving lives in Zika, but one thing that we've heard from the critics who don't want to see the policy move forward, and Colin and Sarah, if you could respond to this, has been all this opening to Cuba isn't helping the average Cuban. This is the new talking point. It's only going to help the government and increase travel right, is not going to help the everyday Cuban. So as somebody who's been on the ground and sees travel happening on a day-to-day basis, give us some examples of why you think this type of interaction and contact and Americans going down there is actually making things better for real people in Cuba, which in the end should be our goal.
Right. So I think one of the most interesting things is the expansion of travel from the United States to Cuba, and really from the world. There's been growth from other markets as well, but particularly from the United States has coincided and really overlapped with the growth of the private sector in Cuba. So if you read a little bit about Cuba, the licensing of working for oneself, as they call it, in Cuba, but there's about 100 categories of small business that Cubans are authorized to do. Some of the most prominent ones would be running restaurants or rental homes, car services, and the likes. So there's a whole plethora. You've seen that sector really grow from about 100,000 5 years ago to about 500,000 now. There's about 500,000 Cubans that have their own businesses. And those would be licensed. I'd say, Gail, who's on the ground, there's a lot of other people that are kind of in the gray market as well that might not have a license, but they're one way or another related to some sort of extra economic activity. So there's just been a flurry of new restaurants, bars, people that had, a 1955 Chevy that was sitting in their backyard, and they realized now I can get a license for a taxi, and they got a remittance from abroad or figured out how to save up and get that back on the car, get that car back on the road again. So there's just been an enormous amount of growth in the private sector. That's very real. And then, that I mentioned 500,000 there. You'd have another million or more Cubans that work in the tourism sector, and they'll have a salary from the government, but they survive mainly off tips. And so you have bellmen, maids, waiters, et cetera, that are all direct. Their income and their well-being is all directly related to tourism. So all of this has really strengthened. I'd say to some extent, there's definitely, and we can talk more about the folks that unfortunately aren't, getting a piece of that and are getting left behind. But there certainly has been a benefit to families in Cuba from the expansion of travel from the United States.
Sarah, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I guess just 2 more points. I mean, one, sort of aside from what's happening in Cuba, what we're currently doing isn't helping the average Cuban person, so why not try something else, would be one thing. And then the other thing, just building a little bit on what Colin said, is to just think about as access to internet is gradually growing in Cuba, as cell phone technology grows, and as you're getting American businesses and bringing technology, that is all kind of mixing to increase exchanges and appetite for information and space for debate, and is producing its own dynamic on the island that's really different than what we've seen, just 4 or 5 years ago.
I would just, James, add, the way that's oftentimes positioned is, you're not helping Cubans. I'd encourage, if anyone that's in Cuba, next time you're there, if you can find a Cuban who tells you that they don't want more tourists and that they think it would be better for their personal economy and the economy of the country to not have more tourists, then, show me that person, because I don't think there's many.
Yeah, I think that is certainly true, but it's important, I think, for us to keep in mind of some of the myths and things that get propagated for why these policies get to stay in power for so long. And that's what I think travel breaks down walls and breaks down barriers, but hopefully Congress will, further take action on this in the very near term. But we're going to open it up in a minute to all of our panelists from both the first panel and this panel to come back and take some questions. Before we do, I want to turn one last time to give some closing thoughts to each of our panelists on things they want to impart on this audience before we close today. Gail, please.
I wanted to say 2 things. One is not directly related to health, except to say that, of course, the first precept of health is do no harm. So I wanted to talk a little bit about an organization, an association that's been put together of travel service providers called RESPECT, Responsible Ethical Cuba Travel. It's been put together by the Environmental Defense Fund, a number of other organizations and academic travel providers. basically to say, let's leave the beaches as pristine as possible. Let's leave the coral reefs as we found them. Let's try to make that travel, that people-to-people travel, work also for Cubans. And I would hope in the end that benefit for the Cubans would also be for an increase in the public sector salaries of teachers and doctors and nurses and so on, because I think it was Reuben who mentioned the human capital in Cuba, and that's a very important piece of what we're really relating to. So we're looking to the Cuban government also to take advantage of this to increase salaries in that area. I would just say that I'm very much looking forward to the visit of Secretary Burwell to Cuba in October, and I hope she takes a package of new regulations with her that will open us up to the possibility of real exchange and real collaboration, joint ventures in cancer vaccines, in diabetes, in aging, in problems of Alzheimer's, in problems of childhood obesity, teen pregnancy. There's all kinds of areas in which both countries share problems, and there's nothing like facing them together, not to mention issues like Zika, like Ebola, that are global health issues, that if we had put our heads together before the Ebola crisis in Africa, how much more would we have been able to do?
Thank you very much. Sarah, please.
Yeah. I mean, mostly what I have to say echoes a lot of what the first panel was saying, which is, you know, President Obama has done a lot to open engagement with Cuba, and it's up to, you know, the American, you know, everything from travelers to businesses to take advantage of the opportunities that we've been given, but then to also keep pushing, because it kind of feels like people sort of feel we're close to the finish line, and we are, but to really get it across, to lift the embargo, will really take sort of all hands on deck from all sectors, and not just the voices that have been pushing for the end of the embargo for a while. It's going to take new voices that have been quiet or that were on the other side before. So.
Thank you very much. Colin, please.
I guess first I would drive home, my first point was just take advantage. It's been so long in the making, and now you can go online and you can book a ticket, and you can book an Airbnb, you can, if you're creative, can figure out how to book a hotel if there's any rooms left. But you can go to Cuba, and there's so much going on. So one would just be, I would say, encourage people. I know a lot of you have been there before, want to go back or make a first trip. So check that out. And then the second point would be to build on Gail's point. I'm happily a member of Respect, the organization that she mentioned, and it's, I think, as you saw through the first panel, through news stories that you read, it's an incredibly special moment in Cuba. It's very exciting. You know, a lot's changed in U.S. policy, but a lot has changed in Cuba, and a lot will continue to change. So it's really a privileged moment to go. It's very exciting. There's a lot of opportunity. It's also very fragile. It's a very fragile moment. So I'd ask people to keep that in mind, whether you're involved in business, whether you're traveling, you have university programs, you're going with a church group. There is a role that we can play in making this a healthy transition that works for everyone. So I would just ask people to keep that in mind, because there's people that have been there, like Congresswoman Lee and others, that have been there from the beginning. They have a vested interest in making sure that this has a positive outcome. And so I'd encourage everyone else to have that same approach.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel. At this time, I'd love to invite back the panelists from our earlier discussion to join our panelists up on stage as well. Everyone stay up here, and we'll do a Q&A from the audience, and
We even have room.
we can ask any and all things.
We got room, yeah. I think we have room.
We're going to have to share some
No,
microphones.
there's room. There's seats. At least we have seats.
Yeah, that we figured out.
Good afternoon, James, and to the panel. Lynette Gibson McElhaney, President of the Oakland City Council in California. And so I'm curious how you see the cities being able to elevate the concerns, whether it's through medical exchanges or sister city relationships that can help formalize the travel even before the embargo is lifted around people-to-people ways. and I'm thinking about education and the work that we're doing in Oakland on equity and on, particularly on Black boys and men in color. So.
Please, whoever wants to take it.
So I would say quickly on the issue of travel, there's a couple of different avenues. I'd say one is directly with the embassy. They tend to be completely inundated at the moment, so that might not be the quickest, most effective approach. And then the other would be find organizations like Medic, for example, has wonderful health-focused programs with travel. They can organize your trip, and they can organize a health-focused program on the ground. We and other organizations work with city councils or organizations. So find somebody who's been there. It's worth doing the initial research to find somebody. The key thing, somebody that's been there for a while, has the know-how, has the contacts, and has the right objective that's in line with you. There's a lot of new players in the travel space. Cuba is complicated. So just find the right partner. But if you have good objectives and you have folks that want to go, you have issues that you're interested in, link up with an organization and they'll tie you in with the local counterparts in Cuba, and you can have a very effective program.
Maybe the other thing I would add to that is what you've described clearly I think would fall into the authorized travel category. So once you put that together and figure out the logistics of it, the good news is you don't have to go to Treasury and get a license for that trip, because almost for sure what you've described would be covered by one of those general categories. And the other thing, which I think will go to a lot of these, is I'm sure you've heard this before, but the president would really like to make the policy changes irreversible. So again, the more that's done in all of these different sectors, the more momentum, I think as Sarah and others have said, builds up to really get Congress to act and end the embargo in total.
Yeah, I think there's a reason why there's such a great representation from Oakland here. Our offices are based in Oakland as well. But I just wanted to say that Medic has a program called Community Partnerships for Health Equity, which is now involved in 13 communities nationwide. And I have to give recognition here, thanks to both of the congresswomen, but also to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. There's a national network that is a mutual learning experience with communities in the United States and communities in Cuba about how to achieve better health and better health equity.
James, I just want to add one thing that I think we've touched on a lot of the need to change here. I think we have to recognize that there's also change needed in Cuba, and part of the president's objectives in opening up this engagement is that there's no better ambassadors for the principles we believe in here in the United States than the American people. And so I think doing that, no matter in whatever category it's in, whether it's health or people to people or business, and if it is business, happy to talk to you about how business delegations go down later. But I think in general, it's important to recognize that we also have a lot, I think, to teach to Cuba about our principles and our beliefs. And so I think all of the different areas of the United States going down there and starting that conversation and then coming back up here and talking about those experiences is what we ultimately want to see happen. So I think not only Oakland, but all of the places in the United States going down there is extremely important.
But especially Oakland.
But especially
But is there any value in the sort of sister city conversation?
I know Tampa Bay has a sister city
Mobile.
relationship. There are a lot of cities that have started doing that already, and the embassy here is actually very capable, despite their limited capacity, to help begin those conversations about what cities would make the most sense for you to connect with. Yeah.
Hi, Patricia Moran from Washington, D.C., and I'm working with the D.C. Council and the Embassy on getting a sister D.C. Havana sister city going, so especially around health. And Gail, I'm so proud of the work that you've been doing for so many years with Medic. My question, Matthew Borman, on the embargo, the blockade, we're talking about things like the Cuban Adjustment Act, the Torricelli, the Helms-Burton. Exactly how can we advocate, how can you advocate to do something about these acts that are holding back the blockade? And one question to Gail. You know, IFCO, I don't know if you know the organization IFCO.
She's right there.
Gail. IFCO needs a lot of help right now. They're under some serious attack from OFAC. And we'd like to get with you to organize something around that. Okay.
So, as I said, the president has publicly called for Congress to end the embargo. And well, there's actually, so the primary embargo act is the Helms-Burton Act. And what that did essentially is codify the embargo as it was in 1996. And the legal standard it set out for any president to end the embargo while that act is in place is the president has to certify that Cuba is a democracy or transitioning to a democracy. So there's the bill, the law has a provision for any president to end the embargo under the terms of the law. But yes, and then the other option, of course, is for Congress to just repeal the law. There would be any number of other laws that would also need to be repealed. So, for example, the Trade Sanctions Reform Act is the law that limits travel to the authorized categories. The administration had the discretion to take that from specific licenses to general licenses, which has been a huge change, but it's codified. So that the travel ban for tourism essentially has to be done by at least removing that provision of TISRA, the Trade Sanctions Reform Act. Similarly, the Trade Sanctions Reform Act prohibits financing of agricultural exports to Cuba, which has a huge impact because the Cubans don't have a lot of money, and in international trade, you typically don't pay for things you export cash on delivery, you finance them. And so that's why, for example, Cuba buys rice from Vietnam and pays $40 a ton premium over what it would be if they got it from Louisiana or Texas, because the Vietnamese will finance it and U.S. companies cannot finance it. So you would really need, make sure that folks have a comprehensive view of all the Cuba-related restrictions, so that a legislative package would eliminate all of them, because there's all these different pieces of it. But the Helms-Burton is far and away the biggest. That's the comprehensive. One other thing I wanted to also, mention on the previous question real quick. Whenever you have delegations going to Cuba, the other thing that we have done, but are happy to answer specific questions, is the things you take with you, again, under the embargo, have to be either specifically licensed or generally authorized. So you want to take your cell phone with you. Our license exceptions are designed to allow you to take your laptops, your cell phones, even donations under a license exception. And we've had a lot of discussions, say, with state delegations. Governor Cuomo, Governor McAuliffe have taken state delegations down, and they typically come in and ask us to make sure they understand exactly what's allowed. But all of this is certainly designed not to be an impediment for a city-to-city exchange. In the real practice, normally you would think that you would need U.S. government authorization to take a cell phone with you to go abroad, right? But Cuba, because of the embargo, you do, although, again, we have a general authorization for that kind of thing. But we're happy to answer questions if folks have specific questions, when you get to that point. That's another law. It's, I'm not sure that it's sort of thought of as part of the embargo per se, but clearly it's a foreign policy directive on U.S.-Cuba relations and the movement of people. So that would be another law that people look at. I think the current packages, I'm not sure that folks are looking at that so much as Helms-Burton, TISRA, and those laws.
Yeah, I'll save Matt here because he's also, by working for the administration, he's put in a position where he cannot necessarily do as much and say as much on the legislative advocacy piece of what needs to happen from a statutory perspective. But basically there is legislation currently in Congress to repeal the embargo. There is also legislation to reform the Cuban Adjustment Act. There are also pieces that just lift the travel ban, just allow ag financing. So there's sort of, you pick your pleasure. There's more than enough legislation out there. It's about sort of getting the movement behind it to push it forward. And there was a second part. Yeah.
I just want to recognize the presence of Gail Walker, the director of the IFCO, the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organizing. And you mentioned that they've been having difficulties with their IRS status, in part due to their Pastors for Peace donations to Cuba. So it is important that organizations that over time have really made it a priority to get their donations directly to the Cuban people, I think deserve that recognition. And please, I'm sure that she agrees, feel free to speak with Gail afterwards if you have questions about what's happening with the IRS. It's one of those other complicated issues that we're trying to deal with.
Great.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kathy Tosas-Mulligan, and I'm from the University of Illinois Cancer Center. And we are really excited to have a partnership with the Ministry of Health. You know, I had a chance to meet with Gail. She received me in her home when we traveled to Cuba, and we also consider IFCO partners. And in this program that we're trying to build basically is to learn from the best practices from the Cuban healthcare system, successful at decreasing infant mortality rate in Cuba to near biological minimum. They have an infant mortality rate of about 2 per thousand, whereas for us it's about 5 per thousand, but in the African American community it's between 11 and 13 babies per 1,000 babies that die. And so in this partnership, our goal is to bring a contingency of Cuban healthcare experts to look at our community health centers' practices and hopefully put together a plan to implement within our clinics to, again, learn from their system. As part of that, we want to be able, of course, to have a true bidirectional partnership with Cuba. This also should involve, if you partner with somebody here in the United States and you have a grant, which we do, we would exchange, right, in that grant. And so we want to be able to share with the Ministry of Health as a consultative fee. I mentioned to you, Matt, a little bit during the break. And so what suggestions might you have, or anybody in the panel might have, as to how we could make some provisions within the law that would allow these kind of exchange of resources that are much needed for health purposes, and particularly those that would address disparities in our community, especially in our communities of color. And I think I will also share, you talked about EverPro. I am an example of how these things would impact our community. My mother passed away as a consequence of an unattended infection that could have been prevented had a drug like EverPro been available to us. So there's a lot to learn. So what suggestions might you have for us to be able to make this happen for the Ministry of Health?
So I have a sort of policy suggestion and a tactical one. What you've described, I think, clearly fits within the President's policy, and I think would already be authorized under the Treasury regulations. I mean, it would be primarily a Treasury jurisdiction, because it's essentially a service and potentially donation of funds. What I will do afterwards, I'll give you my card. Just send me an email, and I'll respond to you with the relevant person from Treasury, and you can just follow up with them. I mean, that's the easiest way. But from a policy viewpoint, this kind of exchange is exactly part of what the President is looking to do with engage and empower and benefit the Cuban people, and in this case, our people as well, frankly. I mean, that's really what you're talking about. Yeah. Please, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. We need to talk later, but it's my understanding from the last package of regulatory changes that foundations and other U.S. entities can, under license, make grants even to public as well as private institutions in Cuba that provide direct services to the Cuban people. Is that the right wording? Right. Anyway, you have to
be a lawyer and a policy expert.
But now this has really opened up a whole nother area that has not entirely been taken advantage of, and I think also there's some work on the Cuban side that needs to be done in order to be able to accommodate that. But I think it's a very important piece, because obviously there's joint learning that's going on, and there needs to be joint research and joint everything. So, and you can't do that with all the funds being only on one end.
And you pointed out that the community health and the education is a piece that frequently is something that large institutions, even small institutions, struggle with here in the United States. So as we talk about technology that goes over there, the NIH actually interaction over there, we could learn a lot, particularly on the south and west sides of Chicago, about how does someone with a lower GDP provide that type of coverage in our neighborhoods. And so we thought it was just a very logical sort of extension. And in fact, everybody is so excited about it, except we get to, now we have to go to OFAC. Why?
Fortunately for OPAC, everyone feels that way.
Felix, please, it's great to see you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Felix Chevalier. I'm a business lawyer, business and government affairs lawyer out of Houston, Texas. James, good to finally meet you in person. I'm also a member of Engage Cuba. I represent a number of large companies in my general practice, some of which have interest in Cuba. I was in Cuba a week and a half ago for the Energy and Infrastructure Summit, I'll be back there in a week and a half with the delegation from Houston. We have the mayor of Houston, business executives from major firms going. They tend to be the ones who have all the access, right? They're the ones who can pay the money, you know, lobbyists and folks like myself to go over there. But I get inundated by entrepreneurs with questions about how can I go over there and, you know, engage and do business. So my question is really two parts. The first question is there an organization or is there an existing organizations that really caters to entrepreneurs seeking to do business in Cuba, and is there a sister component in Cuba to facilitate that process? And then the second portion, since we are here during a CBC weekend, would the Cubans view, let's say, a delegation of African American entrepreneurs in a different light going to Cuba? My parents are Cuban. I've been to Cuba several times, so I'm particularly interested in hearing everybody's response on that.
I'll jump in real quick. So from the Chamber's context, we've taken 13 business delegations down now of all sizes, sectors from across the country. You know, the Chamber is 3 million members, 85% of them are SMEs, right? So it's really the bread and butter of the Chamber. In terms of engaging in Cuba and doing business in Cuba, not only because of the regulatory realities that we face here, which are very burdensome on a company in terms of trying to engage, because you have to have a general counsel that can reach out to OFAC and go through all the different processes of engaging with them, as you guys are all finding out right now, it's very, very challenging. And so the ability to do business in Cuba is more challenging than any other market. I do the entire hemisphere for the Chamber. I do Canada and Argentina. There's nothing like doing Cuban business. It's so much more challenging. And because of this trust deficit that underlines our relationship over the past 50 years, everything that you could think of in terms of doing business in a foreign market, then add the regulatory challenges that we have, and then add on to that this trust deficit that we have. And so Starwood, for example, which got this deal, this major deal that the Cubans were desperate to have, right? This is something that they wanted. It was in their national interest. Still took years to do. Not only because of the regulatory regime here, but because of the reforms that the Cubans had to go through domestically, and then the trust that the companies had to build to get that done. And so the barrier to entry for companies trying to engage in Cuba is very high. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of capital, human capital and personal capital to do that. And so it's been very challenging for SMEs. I've gone around the country and done speeches in South Florida with Cuban Americans that have a cultural affinity for the market, and we've taken them down there, but that barrier to entry is so high that it's very, very challenging. If you don't already have a personal contact on the ground, someone that you can, immediately start that business with. I would say that, if you're interested or there are entrepreneurs that are interested in coming down with us, as the ambassador said, we are putting together our major U.S. delegation to go down to the Feria. We're happy to do that, but I don't want to build this rosy picture that it's easy to do business in Cuba. It takes a long time, and it really has to be, something that you personally are dedicated to, because the ROI on your investment is going to be a very long-term perspective. And the Cubans are all about trust building and building that relationship for the long term, as was mentioned about the aviation industry. If one of our companies went down and said, look, we want to sell you this, and then we go to our next market, it would be a non-starter for the Cubans. It's all about relationship building first. And so that is something that it's to the detriment of, I think, a lot of the entrepreneurs here in the United States that want to engage, that don't have the time or the resources that unfortunately dedicate to that. In terms of your secondary question, everything flows through the Cuban government, right? Everything is a Cuban entity. They look at everything from a business perspective, from a political perspective. What does it mean for my impact here congressionally in the United States? Nothing's a simple business transaction to the Cubans. And so in terms of taking that delegation down, I don't think they would honestly care about, the color of your skin or what city you came from outside of what is the political impact in the United States. If you have honest, true business interests and something that they believe is a priority towards the evolution of their economy, I think they'd welcome that.
The second part of my question, if I came across as the Cubans may not look favorably upon it,
No.
That was certainly not my intention.
Right.
My question would be the opposite.
Right.
Would they be more inclined?
Yeah.
Because there's not, look, I deal with business people all
Why are you not wearing a Guayabera? Right, I'm with you.
If I can show you my text message to Mayor Houston just 2 hours ago, I'm buying him a Guayabera for the record.
Right.
He's a black man. But the point is still the same. You got to be able to relate to them.
Right.
And so the question was really more, do you think that they would find that potentially even more appealing?
No question. Look,
really my question.
I think the power of having the president being Barack Obama and going there and being able to relate more directly to the Cuban people had more impact than having any other person that we've ever had be president before. I think the same can be true from a business context. I don't know if there's a direct correlation in terms of what you'd be able to achieve, but I think there is that cultural affinity that would be able to help connect.
I wanted to say something that's a little off of this particular discussion, but I think it relates directly to your question. I have some friends who have small businesses in Cuba. One of the issues that they're facing, and I think that we've been facing in the U.S. for a long time, is how do you build a socially responsible business? So in my view, it's not so much is it an African American delegation of business people or entrepreneurs, but is it an African American delegation of business people and entrepreneurs that represents socially responsible business? And I think that would make a difference, and not only to government, but to the small businesses who are really dedicated to that. I mean, President Obama mentioned Papito the barber, and I have other friends who are really trying to figure out how you build a socially responsible business, how you give back to your community, not just make money for your own restaurant. And I think this is a big question in Cuba, and I think it's a big question, obviously, for us, too, that we've been struggling with. And in some cases, it has been the African-American businesses that have asked the question first. So to the extent that that is the case, then I would say yes. But I would say also that is a big piece of it, to me, at least.
Yeah, I just want 2 other points on this because I think it's really an interesting question is, Cuba's economy up until very recently, which we've heard about, has been entirely centrally controlled, right? So we've had almost 5 years of real changes in terms of allowing the growth of a private sector. And when Cuba being Cuba government, Cuban, institutions thinking about their macro economy, it's almost like they've decided they can't afford the system they were operating under before. So they allowed people, they needed something for them to do though that would be productive, so they created a space for them to work in a select set of industries. But when they think about, how they drive their economy forward in the 21st century, I think from our view, somewhat unfortunately, it's still really those big players, right? That the state runs it, the state makes these decisions, which makes it very challenging for small and medium-sized enterprises in the United States, not just for the reasons which I agree with that Reuben mentioned, that it's the regulatory burden and the time frame is difficult, but also there's a degree of which Cuba's barely getting to know what these small businesses are in the first place. Creating a culture to help them succeed and connect with the outside world is, phase 3 probably, or hopefully, at least in the future. And so I think that's the challenge. I mean, there is the SBA, and they've in the U.S. and Contreras Suite has been down there at least twice, maybe even more now, and they've had some programs. So I think on the U.S. side, it's a little easier. And as this information is getting more and more known, what the regs are, and they're getting simpler, it makes it a little easier to operate. But I do think, that's going to be a challenge because also Cuba is very interested in the political weight of large corporations and large stakeholders, and so there's a degree of which those get privileged because they're also working with big state companies. And, that will change, particularly as you can build those connections between the small private business owner in Cuba and the business owner here. I think we're seeing a lot of that sort of happening on the margins, and there's real great relationships that are forming, but they're not the, multi-million-dollar deals. They're the start of a partnership.
James, one other thing I would add that we've learned is, as I mentioned, our license exceptions are really focused on private sector actors in Cuba. The challenge, of course, is that unless it's personal luggage or baggage, everything that goes into Cuba has to go through a Cuban government import agency, and it has to go through a Cuban government distribution chain. And so right now, it is extremely difficult, unfortunately, for the barber, the taxi driver, the nurse, to get any supplies that they would like to get from the U.S., because it really has to come in on their own personal baggage or their relatives or somebody's friend, or they have to go to Panama or Mexico to get it. And so one of the things that we've been discussing with the Cuban government is, if you're really interested in, as a government policy, expanding what we would call the private sector, that's a structural thing that has to be looked at within the Cuban system. Because as they said, like, when we go down there and we talk to the restaurant owner and we say, boy, how did you get your refrigerator or your range? They say, it comes in as personal baggage, which,
In small parts.
Yes, in small parts.
Small parts of a suitcase.
Because there's literally no way for them to actually bring it in through the Cuban system, because they're not part of that system, because it's all a government-run system.
And don't forget, entrepreneurs, if they're not working in a tourist industry, are earning a different currency, right? And so until that currency is unified, that reality is a moot point anyway, because they don't have the currency to purchase it, because they're operating in a whole different regime. So there's a lot of changes that have to happen in Cuba, right? Only most recently, the last few years, Colin's been there way more than I have, only in the last few years they started even saying the word private sector, right? In fact, Cuento Pistas was what the start was, and now in meetings, when we meet with government officials, they'll say the words, the private sector, which was kind of mind-boggling to folks that have been doing this for 30, 40 years, right? And so that slow evolution is going to challenge the ability for us to really engage under the regulatory regime that exists to date. But I think as we can continue to drive change, right, as long as U.S. ambassadors, i.e. the U.S. citizens, are going down there and driving and instilling this idea and opportunity, you can slowly, I think, eventually create that space for that. But it's going to take time.
So are non-state actors.
Explosives are going down to Cuba, like the hotels were bombed in Cuba, the hotel lobbies were bombed in Cuba, coming out of Miami. What part of the U.S. government can prevent that?
Oh, yeah, so if someone tried to export explosives from the United States to Cuba, so if you're going to do it legally, you would come in for a license. That's not a license exception. As you can imagine, that would not be subject to a fair review. No, but by definition, and this is not unique to Cuba. I mean, we have a whole very extensive set of export controls on things that can be used to make weapons, and people who export those without a license, when we try to find them and stop them and prosecute them. So that's what Customs and Border Protection does at the ports. They do selective searches of not only incoming but outgoing for exactly those reasons. So yeah, that would be the case if somebody wanted to export explosives to Canada or to the UK or Australia or any country. So that all remains in place. That's sort of standard export controls. Does that answer your question?
Well,
the hotel was bombed in Cuba. How did those explosives coming from Miami? How did they get down to Cuba?
Well, someone was able to evade the law.
Right.
Just like people can evade the law.
To answer your question more directly, today actually, it's interesting that you asked. Today there's technical discussions between Homeland Security, FBI, two other agencies, I forget what, but law enforcement agencies from the United States are meeting with their counterparts in Cuba. And I think there's several factors that we know well in the past of the relationship, but one is just building bridges and talking in law enforcement communities on both sides, customs, FBI, intelligence, et cetera, and that's starting to happen. Luckily, there's changes in the Cuban community, there's changes in the bilateral relationship, so I think everyone's hopeful that those days are long behind us.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. My name is Tara Lynn Gray. My company is Udari Enterprises, also on the board of directors for the California Black Chamber of Commerce. I'm interested in the activities of the Chambers of Commerce in Cuba, specifically looking to understand what type of technical assistance and capacity building programs are there, given the phenomenal growth in the Cuento Propista community. How are you all dealing with that, and what resources and programs are being made available?
So when we launched, the Chamber's been engaged in Cuba for well over 20 years, but we launched a bilateral business council last year, and our formal partner on the ground in Cuba is the Cuban Chamber of Commerce, but like all Cuban entities, formally speaking, they're part of the Cuban government. So the Cuban Chamber of Commerce is actually housed within the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Investment, so the president reports to the Minister of Foreign Trade and Investment. And what they really represent are the major Cuban state government companies, right? So the companies that do the importing, the building, run the hotels, they're members of the Cuban Chamber of Commerce, And then joint ventures, so major corporations that are invested in Cuba have to become members of the Cuban Chamber of Commerce to gain a license to operate. The Cuban Chamber of Commerce, unfortunately, unlike the network of 4,000 chambers that we have around this country, because they're government agencies, don't operate in the way that you and I think of a Chamber of Commerce. They don't do business facilitation for the average Cuban who's trying to do business because, as we just talked about, there's not a real private sector in the way that we think about it. And so what SBA has been doing actually really effectively has been going down, and something that we actually advocated to have Maria Contreras Sweet go down for, is to talk about how effective our SBA agencies have been to help create a private sector. And so we actually had Irma Martinez, who's the first vice president of the Central Bank of Cuba, up here last week and earlier this week, talking about how do we create this engine of growth that we have in this country, right? The engine of growth in this country is our SMEs, right? Our small, medium-sized enterprises. And if Cuba wants to create an effective, growing economy, they have to do the same thing. So we're talking about how we go about doing that and empowering the Cuban people. But there's a lot of ongoing political conversations in Cuba about whether that's something they want to do. There are training programs that already exist in Cuba that train Cuban entrepreneurs. There's something based within the Catholic Church in Cuba called Cuba Emprende. There's other organizations, other universities from across the world that are starting to build partnerships and programs in Cuba. The University of Florida has one in CAI, which is the top 25 business school located in Central America, has programs. There's a lot of programs that are being started to become functional in Cuba to do training programs. But in general, unfortunately, it really isn't that kind of Chamber of Commerce regime that we have in this country. But it's something that we're continually talking about, and hopefully one day we can help build that system. Just again, to be honest with you, we've been successful in doing that around the world. In Peru, for example, there's about 120 chambers of commerce that do the same type of thing that we do here. Hopefully one day we can have that in Cuba, but it's going to take a lot of time, and unfortunately it doesn't exist right now.
I think we have time for one last question if folks have one. Any last parting thoughts before we close? Well, with that, I know it's been a long day and a lot going on. We want to thank our panelists for an incredible day of all things Cuba. Thank you for your perspective and your time. I'll close with this. I want to say again thank you to the leadership of the CBC and Congresswoman Lee for this issue. I mean, this has been, without them, we would not be in this place of where we are today, particularly pushing the political dynamic forward. And we are, as we discussed, made huge progress compared. Think about where we were 2 years ago, before President Obama and President Castro did what they did, both politically courageous and smart things to do, but been stuck in place for a very long time. And so you're seeing, we're going to have you're going to be able to go on American and Delta and United and fly to Cuba. You're going to be able to go there and explore business opportunities. You're seeing U.S. and Cuban government officials sitting down at public forums in Washington, D.C., talking about the need to change policy. And you're seeing, 63% of the Cuban American community in Miami opposing the embargo, and 74% who want to see all travel restrictions lifted. So, and the first time, this is even crazier, the first time in American history you have both presidential candidates on the Republican and Democratic side. Even Donald Trump is okay with this opening to Cuba. Now, he would have cut a better deal, of course, as he said. But that just goes to show you, even 4 years ago with President Obama was not publicly anti-embargo when he ran for re-election. He was basically half pregnant, right? He was, wanted to be there, say he was for it, but he wasn't all the way there. So now that's how quickly the politics have changed. From, we want to support the Cuban people to, that we're fine saying we're anti-embargo, and that's the result of the work of people in this room and many others. But we can't lose this moment. Windows don't stay open forever, and we're right there. We have the majority of the support in the U.S. Senate. We now have 52 co-sponsors on the bill to lift the travel ban, and similar support around agriculture and further trade reform. We are almost knuckle to knuckle in a draw in the U.S. House of Representatives right now. And this election will obviously have consequences on that, so I hope folks are engaged in that. But as well as, we're 10 to 20 votes away from turning the tide. And, one vote at a time can make a difference. I'm probably not allowed to say this, but I'll say it anyway. Almost every member of the CBC is good on Cuba, not all. So I think it would be great if they heard from you. Some of the Florida members could use a little more persuasion and education, I think, on this from, the residue, not because they care, but because they came up in politics when this was something you didn't touch in South Florida, in 1970, 1980. So I think we still have more work to do, even within the CBC. But we're really close. We're really close. And so this is now the moment we got to seize it, grab it, and get this thing done. Thank you all for being here, and thank you so much.